those who haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend it. Definitely check that out because a lot of the context within that will be transferred over to this. Just as a very brief summary, we looked at what would have happened if the British Empire hadn't existed, in the sense of not having any non-white colonies, no colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean and in India. In this scenario, we're going to look at what if Britain hadn't had any empire outside of, the British Isles. What if it hadn't had any empire at all? What we have to understand with this is, as we mentioned in the last one, Ireland has always been the back door of Europe to Britain. A lot of the times in the last few hundred years when there's been an attempt to invade Britain, it's been through the back door of Ireland. So as a result, it makes strategic sense for anyone who's running Britain to at least have a friendly Irish government, at bare minimum, or at least a neutral one. Even in World War II, Churchill even debated whether it made sense to occupy Ireland because of Irish neutrality, because it obviously would have been a lot easier to have had ships come in to Irish ports rather than having to try and avoid the U-boats and come straight to Britain. That was a serious proposal that Churchill had in our timeline. This shows just how important Ireland is to Britain's sense of national security. A hostile government in Ireland, or a hostile foe in Ireland, whether it's Irish or not, that is something which strategically speaking, Britain can't really allow in geopolitical terms. So in this scenario, Ireland is a British colony, but apart from that, there's no British presence in Canada, in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, right? How would you have to excuse there's like a storm outside, damn. Never mind about that. In this scenario, we have to really think about what the world would have been like. We already said in the previous timeline that France would have been the dominant power, around the world. And so it's very much the same in this timeline, just even more so. But it's also something to note that actually the Dutch in this timeline would probably have had a much stronger position. Because in our own regular timeline, the Dutch did have colonies in America. They did explore the region around Australia. You obviously had the Dutch East Indies, which is modern day Indonesia. So inevitably at some point Australia was going to be discovered. Not discovered, from a European perspective, was going to be discovered, because obviously there was Aboriginals living there, was going to be discovered by the Dutch. And the same thing with New Zealand. New Zealand is obviously named after a region within the Netherlands called Zeeland. There's really quite a strong connection there, and it would have been quite easy for Holland to have taken those lands, because the French weren't particularly interested in colonising any of that region. If we look at Canada, it most likely would have just been completely taken over by the French. You already had a New France in our timeline, which was basically everything up from Louisiana in the south, all the way to Quebec in the north. Without the British also competing in Canada, the French would have just had a free hand there. And then with regard to the modern day United States, Holland already had possessions in New Amsterdam, which is present day New York. Now the British kicked them out of that colony, but again, if the British hadn't been there, then there's nothing to say that the Dutch wouldn't have settled the east coast of America. What we have to really think about in this timeline is this. So the point of departure is going to be 1607. This is the year in which the English settlers, because Britain wasn't a concept at that point, English settlers in Virginia, they set up Jamestown. So this was the first successful permanent English settlement in North America. If for whatever reason this had failed, just as the last one had failed in Renu, I can't even pronounce it. It's one looking with R. Do a little bit of research and stuff. Because Renowick, I think, something like that. That failed because the settlers came there and they couldn't survive the winter. They didn't know how to grow the crops there, and they just died out. Thanksgiving in America is the celebration of the early settlers struggling to survive the winter, but the Native Americans show them how to grow food there, how to survive the winter, and that's basically what Thanksgiving is all about. If you didn't have the British being there at all, then the Dutch would have had a free hand in America. What's interesting to note with the Dutch is obviously in comparison to the British, they had much smaller population. Their population would be spread pretty thin at this point between possessions in America, between South Africa, between Australia and New Zealand. In our timeline, a lot of Dutch settlers went to South Africa, which is obviously the Afrikaans. America is obviously a lot closer to Holland than South Africa is. Australia and New Zealand even further away. So we can imagine a lot more Dutch people crossing the Atlantic and settling there then they would have gone to the tip of South Africa and to Australia and New Zealand. So you would have had very, very lightly populated settlements there, but you would have had a lot more emphasis and a lot more focus on the American colonies. What's interesting to note about the United States is that if you look at the different ethnicities there, a large percentage of people are actually of German descent. You know, the most populous ethnic group in America is, the ancestors of Germans. And so it's nothing to say that the Dutch in this timeline, being short for population sources, would have also turned to the Germans. There was already a debate, like just before kind of the time of independence, as to what the official language should be in the colonies, and it narrowly ended up being won by the English side, and it was only because of one German speaker who said, actually no, we probably should have it in English. The United States today could have ended up speaking German in our own timeline, so never mind a timeline where the British are not present at all. German settlers would have far outnumbered any Dutch. Dutch and German is relatively similar anyway, and so it would have been quite easy for that colony to basically been predominantly made up of German speakers, and the colony would have been German speaking. This really fundamentally changes the United States, and it's really something to bear in mind. But even still, even with all of this, it would have been at very best, if the French had allowed it to continue and hadn't taken it over for themselves, it would have been a tiny sliver on the East Coast, which wouldn't have been insignificant, because even in modern day America, of the 300 or so million people that live in the United States, 100 million live on the eastern seaboard. Even them having colonies there, what might be the United States, or whatever it ended up being called, or if it was to get independent at all, again, the butterfly effect is so crazy with this. There's so many things to take into consideration, but all else being equal, we can imagine there would be quite a sizable population on the east coast of America, but obviously very, very fundamentally different than it would have been in our timeline. In this scenario, we're going to focus a lot more on how Britain would have been different, because what a lot of people fail to recognise is that Britain's population today is roughly about 60 million. However, it's estimated that roughly about 20 million people left the British Isles to settle in the predominantly white colonies. If there had been no British Empire, you wouldn't have had millions of people going to Australia and to Canada and to the United States and to New Zealand. That would have meant that the population of Britain would have been potentially at least 20 million people bigger than it currently is. What would have been the impact of this? And then also bear in mind as well, as we mentioned in the last video, if there had been no non-white colonies, then there wouldn't have been a pull factor of non-white people coming to Britain. And if there hadn't been any empire at all, then it would have been even more so a thing where people would have been, no, why are people coming to this country? We don't really need that. In this scenario, there's kind of 2 points of departure, I would say. There's the one where Britain decides to take a lot more of a role on the continent, and be a lot more focused on it. In our timeline, Britain was always more focused on what was happening in its empire. Any kind of involvement it had with European balance of power wars was more to do with maintaining that balance of power so that Britain would continue to have a free hand in the empire. If there was none of this, Britain, it could have been a lot more involved in European affairs, or it could have ended up going the complete opposite way and focused a lot more on so-called splendid isolationism. The idea with this was that Britain being an island, it didn't try to get involved in the affairs of the continent unless there was, a huge balance of power kind of struggle. So if France was becoming too dominant, then Britain would always gang up with the smaller powers to make sure that France didn't take over. And same thing we see with Germany, same thing we see with Spain. Anytime there's been a dominant power on the continent, Britain has always sided with the smaller powers in order to keep a check on the rising power. Britain might have had this kind of splendid isolationism where it only intervenes when necessary, or it might have been fully committed to what was happening in Europe and tried to focus on having a European empire rather than a kind of a world-spanning one. In this scenario, again, so far removed from our own timeline, it's quite difficult to predict all the different factors that would have really taken into place. Now, to focus on what would have happened within the British Isles itself, with all these extra people, right? There's extra potentially 20 million people. Where would they have gone? The fact is that a lot of the people who did end up leaving came predominantly from the peripheries of Britain itself. It came more from the so-called Celtic fringe. Many of them came from Scotland, and many of them came from Ireland. A lot of Irish people will hate me for associating them with the British, but during those times when we're talking about these 20 million people, it says from the British Isles, so Britain and Ireland. You know, without this kind of outlet, would they have left? Like, people from Scotland and Ireland might have basically done what they did in our timeline, but instead of going to a British-owned, like, kind of America, they might have gone to a Dutch-owned America, because obviously they would have wanted land. They would have wanted freedom. Holland would have had a huge like population shortage to actually fill like kind of these colonies. So there is a chance at which you would have had mass migration out of the British Isles to these places. But assuming that this didn't happen, then there would have been a lot more pressure for more democratic reforms at home. We already see with the Chartist movement, we already see with many of these other kind of like movements for democracy. Although Britain was a lot more freer and a lot more democratic than a lot of other countries on the continent, it was still a situation where people, you know, the established order were very hostile to common people actually having a say. And this is why, for instance, it took until World War I that working class men were able to have the right to vote, for instance. If this hadn't have happened, if they hadn't been able to just export their problems and be like, oh, here's some troublesome people, like, oh, like go to Australia, go to America, go somewhere else here, right? If you wouldn't have had this kind of this outlet, this release of pressure, then there would have been a lot more pressure on the establishment to have had a lot of these things, to have had welfare reforms, to have had a more democratic state. In many regards, the standard of living and like the quality of life for people and the actual sense of like having a greater say in how the country would have been run, it would have happened a lot earlier in this timeline than it would have in like our own like real life timeline. If all this happened, where would people have gone? In our own timeline, we had the Ulster plantations. We're probably going to do an alternative history on what if the Stuarts had never like ruled England, and that will come at a later date. But King James VI of Scotland, when he became King James I of England, he wanted to kind of unite two quarrelsome kingdoms together. People in Scotland were very hostile to a union with England, and people in England were very hostile to a union with Scotland. Along the border, you had very, very troublesome people who would constantly do raiding, etc. People were at a loss of what to do with these kind of like these troublesome like people who lived at the border. And so what James I kind of did as an outlet to that and to help bring a bit of harmony between England and Scotland is that he said, right, you lot might be English and Scottish, right, but you're both Protestant. We have a Catholic Ireland which needs to be settled, yeah, which needs to be like sorted out. He basically said, right, you know, we'll set up plantations. So if you come to Ireland, you lot will have all the land you want, you can become rich, etc., etc. You lot move there and basically like kind of take over that region. And that's why Northern Ireland today is predominantly Protestant still. Protestants who live there, they are actually the descendants of people who came from that troublesome border region. If you had this situation whereby you didn't have an outlet to America, to Australia, to all these other places, it might have been a thing where it might have been the policy of London to have encouraged even more people from Scotland and from other places, yeah, to have settled Ireland. What you had within the Ulster plantations, you might have had it large scale across the whole of Ireland, predominantly in the region of Ulster and in the region of Leinster, right? I think I pronounced that right, not sure. You might have had even more Protestant people, even more people from Great Britain settled in Ireland. Would Ireland have got the same level of independence? In our timeline, we already had the Troubles, we already had Irish wars of independence, etc., the Irish Civil War, all of that. If you'd had even more Protestants like living there, would that have potentially shifted the balance of power so much that the Catholic native Irish people wouldn't have had the facilities to kind of like rise up against that? Who knows, right? Like, you know, with this scenario, it really depends. There's a lot of complexities to that. I'll be quite interested to see in the comment section, like, actually, do I really want the comment section to light up about this? The question of like Britain and Ireland is very contentious as it is. So please be nice. Please be nice. Please. But I'll tell you what else would be nice. It would be nice for you to hit the like button. You know them ones? Hit the like button, yeah? Do it now. Now. Do it. You know, actually, just a bit of background. So I'm still a COVID like kind of refugee as such. I'm still holding out. I think actually it's quite a nice kind of setup. And actually in the last video you can see that actually I'm quite low down and thing. You know what? Basically I didn't factor in the fact that my stand for filming actually has extendable legs. So I was using like a coffee table and I was kind of going, oh, this is quite low down. How do I film this? And then my friend told me after I'd finished filming, he was like, why don't you just extend the legs on your tripod? And I was like, Oh yeah, that's actually big brain. So definitely like kind of hit the like button, and hopefully more like big brain juice will kind of like flow to me, and hopefully I won't make as many stupid mistakes in future. And also as well, like subscribe if you haven't done it already. I can see the stats on it. Roughly about 80% of people haven't subscribed, which is typical for most YouTube channels. But come on, this ain't the typical YouTube channel. So like let's turn it on its head. Yeah, let's get 80% of people subscribed, and yeah, keep watching the videos. Hit the bell icon thing so you keep up with each new video that's been uploaded. And yeah, definitely share it with your friends if you have any. I know like some people have to pay for friends. I certainly do. If you've gone through the trouble of paying for friends, you may as well actually share some decent content with them. Then it feels like it's a bit more. They might actually be your friends for real. Then yeah, you might not have to pay for it anymore, because that's certainly like actually no, I still have to pay for my friends. But anyway, now in many regards, Britain would have been in a much stronger position if it had these extra 20 or so million people. If there were to be like a World War One in this scenario, having like an extra like few million like kind of like troops, yeah, because obviously not all 20 million are going to be able-bodied men who are going to fight in the war. Britain's population and Germany's population would have had a lot more parity. World War One was already quite a struggle, and that was with Britain and France versus pretty much Germany, like we're talking about the Western Front. If you had an additional few million, let's say an extra 1 or 2 million like kind of like British soldiers on the Western Front, could that at such an early point have tipped the balance more and more in the Allies' favour? Who knows? But again, with the scenario, would there have even been a World War One? The world would have been so different. It's impossible to say what would have happened, what wouldn't have happened. I think certainly some things that would have happened is this: England and Scotland united formally in the Act of Union in 1707, predominantly because Scotland tried to have its own colonial ventures but failed. And so as a result of this, they kind of was like, actually, we already have like a shared like monarchy, we might as well just unite. If this hadn't have happened, Scotland probably wouldn't have actually like joined England. Also the empire and the different wars that Britain as a whole like kind of like fought together, all this helped to create a more unified sense of we are British, because the Scots had a disproportionate impact on the empire. A lot of colonial administrators, a lot of the soldiers, a lot of the settlers, etc., etc. A big part of Scottish identity was tied up within the British project and like within like the imperial project. If there hadn't been this kind of like empire, then it would have very much still been a thing where England and Scotland would be very, very like separate places. They would have thought of themselves as very separate, and at no point would they have really thought of themselves as we are British, because this concept didn't really exist beforehand. It's kind of a manufactured one in many regards. We can see this now with the end of empire and how we've seen a rise of English nationalism and also obviously Scottish nationalism. The Scottish referendum in 2014 for independence, the independent vote obviously narrowly lost. However, with the Brexit vote in 2016, you can see a clear division between England and Wales and Scotland and like Northern Ireland. And because of this, we're starting to see that England and Wales wants to leave the EU, and Scotland wants to potentially like get its independence and join the EU. Now that there's not an empire, you're really starting to see the schisms between the two. You're starting to see the breakdown of this relationship. And without there being an empire at all, you wouldn't have really had like this kind of sense of shared like unity in the first place. England and Wales would have been pretty much by itself. You might obviously still have had Ireland, although they might have had their own parliament. It's quite difficult to kind of think in this scenario, but England would have been a lot more of a kind of isolationist country. The best way to describe it probably would have been Switzerland on sea. Switzerland obviously has strong defences, but it doesn't tend to get involved in the affairs of Europe. England, I think, probably might have ended up like along a similar lines, where it has a strong navy, so it doesn't have to necessarily worry about other places. Yeah, it might have been worried about invasions from Ireland or from Scotland, and so we would have had a bit more presence there, like militarily. But apart from that, it probably would have been a lot more kind of like non-interventionist potentially. But if this was the case, and all the other empires were in Europe had colonial powers, and England didn't, well then England's like kind of pride in itself of being land of hope and glory, the mother of the free. I think that both strategically speaking and also morally speaking, Britain would have had a lot more incentive and a lot more of a like moral leg to stand on to actually been anti-imperialist. We already see this with the United States. The fact that it used to be a colony and the fact that it didn't actually have like many colonies around the world meant that when European colonialism was really dominant around the world, they had a very anti-imperialist streak, and so they really supported the breakup of the British and French empires. If England hadn't had an empire, then they would have used that as a thing of, look at France, it has slavery, it has empire, and they would have probably armed and aided any kind of anti-imperialist strains within the French Empire, because it would have made strategic sense for them to make the French be bogged down in in colonial wars, rather than having a free hand and be able to focus on fighting England. England, I think, would have had a much better moral position. To its great credit, it has been that land of hope and glory. It has been that mother of the free. It has been the mother of all parliaments. It has been a liberal, maybe not a full democratic system, but it has had liberalism. It's where liberalism arose from, as such, as we've discussed in our previous videos on the history of democracy and history of liberalism. Its high ideals, which it's professed, has always been contradicted by the hypocrisy of being how can you be a liberal empire? That doesn't make any sense here. How can you be a country that professes about liberty, and yet the whole point of empire is that you are taking liberty away from other people? You can't have liberalism and also have slavery. You can't have liberalism and have an empire, right? They're contradictory things. Britain, morally speaking, doesn't have as much of a leg to stand on because of this inherent contradiction, this inherent hypocrisy within its history. If England hadn't had any colonial possessions, if it hadn't left its own shores, then it would have had a much stronger moral case, to be able to say, actually, we want this this world of free trade. We want this liberal world order. Morally speaking, people would have had a lot less problems with Britain, and people would probably take a lot more pride in being British, or a lot more pride in being English, rather than always being tainted in some people's eyes to this idea of racism and imperialism, etc., etc. In summary of both videos, I think that without the British Empire, first of all, Britain would be richer than it currently is. Now, what I mean by that is, if we compare Switzerland, which obviously, it being a landlocked country, it had no empire, but as a result of that, they had to innovate, it had to be entrepreneurial. And I think that, Switzerland on sea, i.e. England, it probably would have focused a lot more on itself. It still would have had free trade. It still would have been the commercial hub of Europe. The Industrial Revolution, I still think, would have happened. Britain wouldn't have wasted so much men and resources on trying to maintain this world-spanning empire. I think that British companies, in any event, would have gone to different places. They might not have had the same access to some of the resources as they did in our timeline, but I think that still Britain, it probably would have been richer in that regard. Britain would have had a much stronger moral case, because it being the land of liberty and freedom and stuff, it would have been able to have argued that position from an actual legitimate moral standpoint. And a lot of people who talk down about Britain, they wouldn't have been able to be like, oh well, Britain's racist and imperialist and etc., etc. They wouldn't have had that that link, because if there was no empire, they wouldn't have had any of those sort of things. And so Britain's moral standing would have been a lot less blemished, than it was in the real world. The world would have been a very different world. France, obviously, being the dominant cultural force in the world, the dominant economic force. I think that protectionism, mercantilism, bureaucracy, this would have been the dominant world order, in opposition to what you see with Pax Britannica and later Pax Americana, because obviously with America, it's basically followed a lot of what Britain has done. If we think about it, we've had English speaking, liberal and relatively free trading, entrepreneurial countries being the dominant world force for about 200/250 years. Without England having that role, and without then America taking up the baton as such, the world that we live in now would be very, very different, with very, very different value system. So would the world have been a better or worse place? I don't know. I think definitely hit me up in the comment sections as to what you think. I think obviously, as long as these two videos have been, undoubtedly there would have been multiple things which I've left out. It would take days worth of things to cover everything, the British British Empire did, because you're talking about something which lasted for 400 years and touched literally every single country on earth, regardless of whether it was formerly a colony or not. Its impact like had butterfly effects which like reverberate around the world. It's very, very difficult to kind of like say how different the world would have been. We've obviously posited some like general themes, like general trends that we can imagine, but I don't know. England, obviously with its larger population, it would be a stronger force in Europe, but at the same time, yeah, I think generally speaking, I think that outside of Europe it wouldn't be as powerful as it is. One could probably think of it as the equivalent of like Japan. Like, yeah, Japan's very wealthy, it's very prosperous, it's very industrious. At the same time, Japan didn't have a world-spanning empire. Probably Japan or Switzerland is probably a good like model for what Britain would look like. That's probably where we have to end the video. I would be very interested to see what people think. It's undoubtedly a very complex topic, so there's going to be a whole heap of different opinions on this, so definitely let me know yours. So definitely stay tuned for the next video we're going to be doing, which, continuing our alternative history series, we're going to be looking at what would happen if America collapsed in civil war. Now, What If Alt this and a few other like kind of alternative history things have really covered this scenario. However, I think that a lot of them have focused on American domestic policies and how America would be domestically, but have not looked as well as they might have at like kind of as at the geopolitical kind of situation in the world. I'm not saying that they haven't touched on it at all. I just think that there's a few things that they've not really like thought of. Not to discredit them at all. I think they've done a brilliant job. But I think my video is basically just going to be touching on some of building on some of like the work that they've already done, looking at certain things like such as the geopolitical situation. Like a lot of countries at the moment, without this kind of American like world order, would start like being very expansionist, because we've lived in a world where countries, like, it's not the norm anymore for countries just invade and conquer places. And I think that without America being this overarching like global hegemon, I think that a lot of other countries will try their luck, certainly on a regional level. Definitely stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and share it with your friends, and if you have any, of course, if you have any. But yeah, but definitely thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.